Hello! Happy Wednesday, everyone. Crazy hair today because it's a lazy day. I don't know how you guys feel, but I've been trying to give myself like to-do lists by time, like give myself a whole little schedule for the day to kind of keep myself proactive about things. And today that was one of those days that just went out the window. Couldn't wake up, couldn't get going. I'm literally like just brushed my teeth just so I could be on camera with you guys. So you're welcome. Not that you know if I have fresh breath, but at least I feel shiny. So yeah. But back to War and Peace. Welcome to Quarantine Storytime for my returning viewers. I have the live chat going, so pop on and say hi or ask me any questions. Today, we're going to finish part 2. So that's exciting. It's going to be a bit of a shorter read today because the end of the battle section in part 2 is a decent amount. It's not a ton, but that'll take us to the end. And then part 3, I think, jumps back to Moscow or Petersburg. So, hey. So yeah. So rather than, I'm going to just go ahead and stop at the end of part 2 today. And so tomorrow we can start part 3. Very exciting. And just have a clean break of it. So yeah. So we're in the midst of the battle. I don't know what you guys have been doing to keep yourself occupied, but when I'm not reading War and Peace with you, I've been working on fixing a pair of socks. Like, I should have like taken care of a hole that started, but I didn't, and it got kind of big. So I just like crocheted a patch for this pair of socks. And everyone's like, "Are you that poor?" And I'm like, "Well, no, but I just really like these socks." So I crocheted a big patch and sewed it onto my socks. So I hope that works. We'll see. But they're like really comfy socks, and they're like long socks. So it seemed silly to waste a whole sock when all the rest of it is fine just for a hole down here. So I'm also going to crochet a little patch for my other socks that are starting to wear out and hopefully get ahead of this holy sock game. Because, you know, if you think about it, people used to fix their clothes. They used to darn holes in their socks. They used to, like, get shoes repaired, which I do, as opposed to just, like, pitching and buying new things. So I'm trying to be better about taking care of the things that I have and, like, repairing things that when I can and making them last longer. And partially it's like, hey, I don't have the money to be buying a million new things. And also partially it's better for the environment, right? So yeah, it's also a good way to pass the time right now when I'm not reading War and Peace. So yeah, War and Peace. If it's your first time, welcome. Or if you missed a section, remember I do have the playlist up on my channel, so you can tune in to past readings and pick up anything where we left off. So where we left was we're in the battle. The right flank is where the commander was, and they were facing the French forces. The left flank was about to get routed, but thankfully it looked like part of the Russian forces had been hidden in some woods and were able to startle the French troops and hopefully clear a path for the left flank to be able to retreat. And then the center, which was basically the few battalions that were there, it seems like they were dispersed, and it's basically like 4 cannons that were on a hill being led by Commander Tushin. We're just holding the line, and I guess they took out the town of Schöngraben, where a bunch of the French were coming from. And yeah, so Prince Andrei was finally there and able to get Tushin to retreat. And so it seems like they're going to be able to get that center part to retreat back across a ravine. And I think they said they lost 2 cannons, but they still had, yeah, they were able to get 2 out. 1 was smashed and 1 was abandoned. So yeah. So we were at that kind of retreat stage. And remember, this is the vanguard forces hoping to hold off the French long enough for the rest of the Russian army to back them up and protect the Austrian court from the French forces, Bonaparte's French forces coming in. And as we brought up in an earlier chat, that this is around 1805 is when this starts. So if you're a history buff and you're familiar with the Bonaparte Wars, then this is still kind of early in his career. All right, so without further ado, we're going to do Part 2, Volume 1, Part 2, Section 21 today. All right, let's go. The wind grew still. Black clouds hung low over the place of battle, merging on the horizon with powder smoke. It was getting dark, and the glow of the fire showed more clearly in two places. The cannonade became weaker, but the crackle of gunfire behind and to the right was heard more often and close. As soon as Tushin, with his guns, driving around or over the wounded, came out from under fire and descended into the ravine, he met the superiors and adjutants, among whom were the staff officer and Zherkov, who had been sent twice and had failed twice to reach Tushin's battery. All of them, interrupting each other, gave and conveyed orders of how and where to go, and reproached and reprimanded him. Tushin had no orders to give and rode silently behind them on his artillery nag, fearing to speak because he was ready at every word to burst into tears, not knowing why himself. Though the order was to abandon the wounded, many of them dragged after the troops, asking to be put on the guns. The dashing infantry officer who had run out of Tushin's lean-to before the battle was put on Matveyevna's carriage, a bullet in his stomach. At the foot of the hill, a pale hussar junker, holding one arm with his other hand, came up to Tushin and asked for a seat. "Captain, for God's sake, I've bruised my arm," he said timidly. "For God's sake, I can't walk. For God's sake." It was clear that this junker had already asked for a seat more than once elsewhere, and everywhere had been refused. He asked in an irresolute and pitiful voice, "Tell them to give me a seat, for God's sake." Give him a seat, said Tushin. "You, uncle, spread a greatcoat under him." He turned to his favorite soldier. "And where's the wounded officer?" "We unloaded him. He died," someone answered. "Give this one a seat. Sit down, my dear, sit down. Spread the greatcoat under him, Antonov." The junker was Rostov. He was holding one arm with the other hand, was pale, and his lower jaw was trembling feverishly. He was seated on Matveyevna, the same cannon from which they had unloaded the dead officer. The greatcoat spread under him had blood on it, which stained Rostov's breeches and hands. "What are you, wounded, dear heart?" asked Tushin, coming to the cannon on which Rostov was sitting. "No, bruised." "And why is there blood on the side plates?" asked Tushin. "That officer bloodied it, your honor," the artillerist replied, wiping the blood with the sleeve of his greatcoat, and as if apologizing for the unclean state the gun was in. They were barely able, with the help of the infantry, to get the guns up the hill, and having reached the village of Guntersdorf, they halted. It grew so dark that it was impossible to make out the soldiers' uniforms from 10 paces away, and the crossfire began to die down. Suddenly, close by on the right-hand side, shouts and gunfire were heard again. Shouts flashed in the darkness. This was the last attack of the French, which was being fought off by soldiers sheltering in the village houses. All rushed out of the village again, but Tushin's guns could not move, and the artillerists, Tushin and the junker, silently looked at each other, awaiting their fate. The crossfire began to die down, and soldiers, talking animatedly, poured out of a side street. "Unhurt, Petrov?" asked one. "We roasted him, brother. They won't try that again," said another. "Couldn't see a thing. What a roasting they gave their own. Couldn't see. It's so dark, brother. Got anything to drink?" The French had been beaten off for the last time. And again, in total darkness, Tushin's guns, as if framed by the humming infantry, moved on somewhere. It was as if an invisible, gloomy river were flowing in the darkness, all in one direction, with a hum of whispers, talk, and the sound of hooves and wheels. In the general hum, the groans and the voices of the wounded sounded most clearly of all in the gloom of the night. The groans seemed to fill all the gloom surrounding the troops. Their groans and the gloom of the night were one and the same. After some time there was a stir in the moving crowd. Someone with a suite rode by on a white horse and said something as he rode by. "What did he say? Where to now? A halt or what? Did he thank us or what?" Eager questions came from all sides, and the entire moving mass began to push upon itself. Evidently those in front had stopped, and a rumor spread that there was an order to halt. They all halted where they were, in the middle of the muddy road. Fires were lit, and the talk became more audible. Captain Tushin, having given orders to his company, sent one of the soldiers to look for a dressing station or a doctor for the junker, and sat down by the fire to the soldiers. The soldiers had started on the road. Rostov also dragged himself to the fire. A feverish trembling from pain, cold, and dampness shook his whole body. Sleep was coming over him irresistibly, yet he could not fall asleep from the tormenting pain in his arm, which ached and found no comfortable position. Now he closed his eyes, then he gazed at the fire, which seemed a hot red to him, then at the stooping, weak little figure of Tushin, who was sitting next to him Turkish fashion. Tushin's large, kind, and intelligent eyes were directed at him with compassion and commiseration. He saw that Tushin wanted with all his heart to help him in some way and could not. On all sides one could hear the footsteps and talk of the infantry walking, driving, and settling themselves around. The sounds of voices, footsteps, and horses' hooves treading in the mud, the crackling of firewood far and near merged into one rippling hum. Now it was not, as before, an invisible river flowing in the darkness, but like a gloomy sea subsiding and quivering after a storm. Rostov's mindlessly watched and listened to what was happening before him and around him. An infantryman came up to the fire, squatted down, putting his hands to the fire, and turned his face away. "You don't mind, Your Honor?" he said, turning questioningly to Tushin. "I've strayed from my company, Your Honor. I don't know where myself. Worse luck." Along with the soldier, an infantry officer with a bound cheek came up to the campfire and addressed Tushin, asking him to move the guns a little bit to let his wagon pass. After the company commander, 2 soldiers ran to the campfire. They fought and cursed terribly, pulling some boot from each other. "Sure you picked it up. What a quick fingers," cried one in a hoarse voice. Then came a thin, pale soldier, his neck bandaged with a bloody footcloth, and an angry voice demanded water from the artillerists. "What, is a man to die like a dog?" he said. Tushin ordered them to give him water. Then a merry soldier ran up, asking for a little fire for the infantry. "Some hot little fire for the infantry? Keep well, dear countrymen. Thanks for the fire. We'll pay it back with interest," he said, carrying the burning brand somewhere into the darkness. After this soldier, 4 soldiers carrying something heavy on a greatcoat passed by the campfire. One of them tripped. "The devil's left firewood on the road," he growled. "He's dead. Why carry him around?" asked one of them. You!" And they disappeared into the darkness with their burden. "What, it hurts?" Tushin asked Rostov in a whisper. "Yes. The general wants you, Your Honor. He's staying in a cottage here," said the fireworker, coming up to Tushin. "At once, dear heart." Tushin got up and, buttoning his greatcoat and smoothing himself out, left the campfire. Not far from the artillerist campfire, in a cottage prepared for him, Prince Bagration was sitting over dinner, talking with some commanders of branches who had gathered with him. There was the little old man with half-closed eyes, greedily gnawing on a lamb bone, and the 22-year irreproachable general, flushed from a glass of vodka and dinner, and the staff officer with the signet ring, and Zherkov, looking around uneasily at them all, and Prince Andrei, pale, with compressed lips and feverishly shining eyes. In the corner of the cottage stood a captured French standard, and the auditor, with a naive face, fingered the fabric of the standard and shook his head in perplexity, perhaps because he was indeed interested in the look of the standard, or perhaps because it was hard for him, hungry as he was, to look at the table where there was no place set for him. In the cottage next door was a French colonel, taken prisoner by the dragoons. Our officers clustered around him, studying him. Prince Bagration thanked particular superiors and asked for details about the action and the losses. The regimental commander, who had been reviewed at Braunau, reported to the prince that as soon as the action began, he withdrew from the woods, gathered the woodcutters, and letting them pass by him, started a bayonet attack with 2 battalions and overwhelmed the French. As soon as I saw that the 1st battalion was in sortie, Your Excellency, I stood there on the road and thought, I'll let them pass and then meet them with ranged fire, and that's what I did. The regimental commander had so wanted to do that, he had been so sorry that he had had no time to do it, that it seemed to him that all this was exactly so. And perhaps it really was so, as if one could make out in this confusion what was and was not so. With that, I must observe, Your Excellency, he went on, remembering Dólokhov's conversation with Kutuzov and his own last encounter with the demoted soldier, that the demoted private Dólokhov, before my eyes, took a French officer prisoner and particularly distinguished himself. And I also saw the attack of the Pavlogradsky hussars, Your Excellency, interrupted Zherkov, looking around uneasily, though he had not seen any hussars that day, and had only heard about them from an infantry officer. They broke 2 squares, Your Excellency. Some smiled at Zherkov's words, expecting a joke from him as usual, but noticing that what he had said also contributed to the glory of our arms and of the day, they assumed serious expressions, though many of them knew very well that what Zherkov had said was a lie, with no foundation at all. Prince Bagration turned to the little old colonel. Thank you all, gentlemen. All branches acted heroically, infantry, cavalry, and artillery. How is it that 2 guns in the center were abandoned? He asked, seeking someone with his eyes. Prince Bagration did not ask about the guns of the left flank. He already knew that all the cannon there had been abandoned at the very beginning. I asked you to go, I believe, he turned to the staff officer on duty. One was knocked out, the staff officer replied, but I cannot understand about the other. I was there myself all the while and giving orders, and I had only just left. It was hot, to tell the truth, he added modestly. Someone said that Captain Tushin was there near the village and had already been sent for. You were there too, said Prince Bagration, turning to Prince Andrei. Of course, we nearly ran into each other, said the staff officer on duty, smiling pleasantly at Volokhonsky. I did not have the pleasure of seeing you, Prince Andrei said coldly and abruptly. They all fell silent. Tushin appeared in the doorway, timidly making his way from behind the generals' backs. Going around the generals in the crowded cottage, embarrassed as usual at the sight of his superiors, Tushin did not see the staff of the standard and stumbled over it. Several voices laughed. How was it that a gun was abandoned? Asked Bagration, frowning not so much at the captain as at those who laughed, among whom Zherkov's voice sounded louder than the others. Only now, at the sight of his dread superiors, did Tushin realize in all its horror, his guilt and disgrace at having remained alive while losing 2 guns. He had been so agitated that until that moment he had not managed to think of it. The laughter of the officers threw him off still more. He stood before Bagration with a trembling lower jaw and was barely able to say, I don't know, Your Excellency. I had no men, Your Excellency. You could have taken some of the covering troops. Tushin did not tell him that there were no covering troops, though that was the plain truth. He was afraid to let down another officer that way, and silently, with fixed eyes, looked straight into Bagration's face as a confused student looks into his examiner's eyes. The silence was rather prolonged. Prince Bagration, probably unwilling to be severe, could not find what to say. The rest did not dare mix into the conversation. Prince Andrei looked at Tushin from under his eyebrows, and his fingers twitched nervously. Your Excellency, Prince Andrei broke the silence with his sharp voice, you were pleased to send me to Captain Tushin's battery. I was there and found 2/3 of the men and horses killed, 2 guns crippled, and no cover at all. Prince Bagration and Tushin now looked with the same intentness at Volokhonsky, who was speaking with restraint and agitation. And if Your Excellency will allow me to voice my opinion, he went on, we owe the success of the day most of all to the operation of this battery and the heroic endurance of Captain Tushin and his company, said Prince Andrei, and without waiting for a reply, he got up at once and stepped away from the table. Prince Bagration looked at Tushin, and obviously not wishing to show any mistrust of Volokhonsky's sharp judgment, and at the same time feeling himself unable to believe him fully, inclined his head and told Tushin he could go. Prince Andrei went out after him. Thank you, dear heart, you rescued me, Tushin said to him. Prince Andrei looked at Tushin and, saying nothing, walked away. Prince Andrei felt sad and downhearted. All this was so strange, so unlike what he had hoped for. Who are they? Why are they here? What do they want? And when will it all end? Thought Rostov, looking at the shifting shadows before him. The pain in his arm was becoming more and more tormenting. Sleep drew him irresistibly. Red circles danced before his eyes, and the impression of those voices and those faces and a feeling of loneliness merged with the feeling of pain. It was they, these soldiers, wounded and not wounded. It was they who crushed and weighed down and twisted the sinews and burned the flesh of his racked arm and shoulder. To get rid of them, he closed his eyes. He became oblivious for a moment, but in that brief interval of oblivion, he saw a numberless multitude of things in a dream. He saw his mother and her large white hand, saw Sonia's thin little shoulders, Natasha's eyes and laughter, and Denisov with his voice and mustache, and Telyanin and his whole story with Telyanin and Bogdanich. That whole story was the same as this soldier with the sharp voice, and that whole story with this soldier were what held, crushed, and pulled his arm to one side so painfully and relentlessly. He tried to get away from them, but they would not let go of his shoulder for a moment, for a split second. It would not hurt, it would be well, if they were not pulling on it, and there was no getting rid of them. He opened his eyes and looked up. The black canopy of night hung 3 feet above the light from the coals. A dust of falling snow flew through the light. Tushin did not return. The doctor did not come. He was alone. Only some little soldier now sat naked on the other side of the fire, warming his thin yellow body. Nobody needs me, thought Rostov. There's nobody to help me or pity me. And once I was at home, strong, cheerful, loved. He sighed and involuntarily groaned as he sighed. Ouch, it hurts, eh? The little soldier asked, waving his shirt over the fire, and not waiting for a reply, he grunted and said, Quite a few folk got damaged today. Awful. Rostov was not listening to the soldier. He looked at the snowflakes dancing above the fire and remembered the Russian winter with a warm, bright house, a fluffy fur coat, swift sleighs, a healthy body, and all the love and care of a family. And why did I come here? He wondered. The next day, the French did not renew the attack, and the remnants of Bagration's detachment joined Kutuzov's army. And that is the end of part 2. So we'll stop there for today. The next section seems a bit long, and it's the beginning of part 3 and another place in our story. So we'll leave off there with the battle. A couple things come to mind. Of course, Rostov's final question, why did he come here? Rather interesting, the young soldier with all these ambitions until you actually face war and wonder why you came in the first place. Good to hear. It sounds like the vanguard, what was left of it at least, made it out from under the French forces and were able to join the rest of the Russian army. So yay to our Russian. I like how Tolstoy was referring to it as our army. I mean, because he's Russian, so he would. But reading it as a non-Russian, it's kind of interesting, and so you feel that sense of, I guess almost Russian patriotism, or this camaraderie with the soldiers in this story. And interesting, the sort of everyone's mistelling of events of the day at the end. Bagration asking, literally believing everything everyone's saying, and turning to Tushin, the one man who probably did the most in the battle with the least, and turning to blame him for losing a couple guns when, the one guy, the one regimental commander on the left flank, who was in, basically an ego match with this other general on the left flank, almost lost a bunch of the troops there because they weren't ready for battle, because they were there, basically having like a cockfight between their two of them and their egos. And then you have Zhirkov and the staff officer who were supposed to tell Tushin to retreat and spread other news between the different commands, and who didn't because they were too afraid to get too close enough to the battle to actually be useful. And so I'm kind of glad, I was really glad that Prince Andrei stood up for Tushin and his artillerists, because he was the only one there who really saw what was happening and actually got involved. As the other ones, were like, oh yeah, I saw this happen. You weren't there. You didn't see that happen. You didn't give that order. The one commander who said he gave the order to, return fire on the left flank or whatever. As you remember from the reading yesterday, I think he gave an order to some soldiers who were running away, and they all pretty much ignored him until a different group of soldiers came in to back them up. So it's a lot of interesting, a lot of the egos that were at play, and no one's going to be willing to say, yeah, I was rather cowardly in the face of the battle or whatever. But thankfully, I'm glad Prince Andrei was there to stick up for Tushin, because he seemed like the only guy. Tushin seemed like the only guy doing anything. So, yeah, those are my feelings on it. But yeah, feel free to drop comments about any of your favorite characters, or I'm glad so far that none of our main characters have passed away. Though I'm a little worried about like young Nikolai Rostov's arm. He should get that looked at. It sounds. I wonder if it's like a bad break or gunshot break thing because he fell off his horse combination thing. So yeah. Well, thank you all very much. Like I said, it's a little bit shorter today, but we will return tomorrow with a whole new change of scenery in part 3. So thank you all very much, and have a lovely rest of your Wednesday. Bye.